Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we're going to be doing a deep dive review. It's been a little while, but we're finally getting back to this traditional decision space format, covering Bruno Cathala's 5 Tribes. An older game, but a classic. And we'll be doing the traditional deep dive format where we're going to talk a little bit of the game background and really get into like the nitty gritty of the types of decisions that you make in this game and how it feels to make them.
Yeah, I'm so excited to dive into talking about 5 Tribes. Jake, I think this is one of those games that published in 2014 that for a period of time just kind of captured maybe an overly warranted amount of sort of hobby share in terms of when games would get recommended. 5 Tribes would almost always be one of the games that gets recommended. And now I feel like it's mentioned a lot more sparingly, but it's a pretty unique game in terms of the layout and sort of feel of the decisions. So I'm excited to dive in and see what lessons we can learn about decisions in games from a game that, and for all intents and purposes, is pretty unique among games we've covered on the show.
All right. Well, do we have anything to get into with housekeeping, or should we just go straight into game background?
I think just like straight into ratings and reviews.
Oh my.
We're so off the cuff. Jake, you go first.
Yeah, so we always do ratings, reviews at this point of the show to clue people in that this is not the important takeaway, but some context that will help frame the rest of our conversation. So I'm going to give 5 Tribes an 8 out of 10. It's a game that has like really obvious strengths and really obvious weaknesses. And for me, I really like the strengths, and the weaknesses are easy for me to overlook. I think what's so great about this game is it's a very, very satisfying search type game where you get to look at the board, find really creative plays, trigger really exciting combos, set things up, and then knock down the towers that we've built for ourselves. So it's got this like really fun, gamey toy factor, offering a really fun solitaire puzzle and some elegant designs. The downside to me is in that search, right? It can be a little bit overbearing. It can cause a lot of analysis paralysis on the table. It can be an extremely bad offender of that. So, you know, if that's something that you or your group is subject to and it makes you not like games, then this is a really easy game to skip. But for me, it hasn't been that big of a problem on the table if we go in with a shared understanding, and it is really fun playing asynchronously online, where that just kind of skirts around that problem. So it's a strong candidate for that type of gameplay as well. So 8 out of 10 for me.
Nice. So for me, I love Bruno Cathala games. I think that games that Bruno Cathala makes typically have really strong turn-to-turn decision-making, and oftentimes have, like Jake mentioned, really nice build-up in terms of setting yourself up for interesting turns in the future, having to make turn-to-turn decisions that are factoring in what's to come. Good forward planning stuff. But with that said, I think for me, the downsides of 5 Tribes and the high search required, amplified by this auction mechanism around the turn order, makes the game in some ways ask a little bit too much of the player for my taste on any given turn. The amount that I have to study what's happening at the start of every turn and search for options just feels tremendously high. And the fact that in a 4-player game, the board state might be completely transformed by what the previous player and the 2 players prior to that means that I can't even sit and study the board turn to turn as effectively as I wish. So while I really like the sort of the top part of the bell curve of funness in terms of 5 Tribes, I find a lot of the structural decisions of how to bring the game together not anywhere near as much fun as the actual core mechanisms, which are just a slam dunk. So for me, I really like 5 Tribes. This is a solid 7.5 out of 10. But it's not my favorite Cathala game. And I think it does really suffer from some structural decisions that just slow it down and kind of limit the speed in which you can chase the waning decisions to completion. But yeah, it's a great game.
But more importantly, where would you put it on the Solomon scale?
Oh,
Which is 1 to 3.
Yeah, this is a 3.
It's a 3 for me as well.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe that's
Okay.
more useful to folks.
Maybe though, yeah. I really
All
like
right.
it. It's a good game.
Let's
Yeah.
jump in to the game background. So we already mentioned, designed by Bruno Cathala, who has a ton of notable games in the hobby, dating all the way back to 2005 with Shadows
Yeah.
of Camelot. Other ones that are, I would say, big games are Mr. Jack, a classic 2-player game, Cyclades in the trilogy with Komet and Inish, Seven Wonders Duel,
Though
maybe.
Komet and Inish are not Cthulhu games.
No, I know, but I'm just
Okay.
saying it's like in that, yes, good clarification.
Yeah.
But it's in that like trilogy of games that, again, occupies like a, more than their fair share of the hobby space, I would say.
Sure.
Seven Wonder Duel, possibly the biggest game in terms of like racing up the Board Game Geek top 100 ranks.
King Domino.
King Domino, we've covered Kanagawa, we've covered, and then even more recently, a big hit with 2022's Sea Salt and Paper. So obviously, a really impressive design pedigree.
And Five Tribes was 2014's Days of Wonder. Oh my gosh, 2014's Days of Wonder release. Days of Wonder, a publisher that typically releases just one big game a year, puts all of their marketing efforts behind it and really invests. So games from Days of Wonder like this are things like Heat or Ticket to Ride, Memoir 44. Those are other Days of Wonder games you might know. So in 2014, their big release was Five Tribes. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, you mentioned it was like a game that's really, used to be popular. I wonder, I think back when this game was released, I wonder if it was like a big hit for them or if it's been more of like a slow burn game. Because I kind of think the latter.
You think it's been more of a slow burn game? That's interesting. It is in the BGG top 100 and still is to this day.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy, actually. That surprises me.
42,000 ratings.
All right. People like them some Five Tribes. And probably getting reinvigorated because of the Board Game Arena implementation, which might still be an alpha right now.
Yep.
But we've been playing it a ton. It's coming, it seems, soon-ish to beta. And since it works great, it seems like a perfect
We've pretty much had no issues. Yeah.
And I mean, that's the reason we're covering it, right? Like that got us playing it and talking about it more. And sure enough, here it is as a deep dive. So that might bring it back into the fore again.
This is a game you own and have played on the table, though.
Yeah, it was one of my, I guess my own personal history with the game is it was one of my very first big box purchases. And I have a distinct memory of being in the game shop and I was deciding between Five Tribes and Raw. Those were like the two games I was like holding up and ultimately picked Five Tribes. I wonder if I would be just like a different gamer today if I had found Raw and Knizia as my second or third gaming purchase.
Yeah, would we not have had as much diversity of thought in the show?
Yeah.
We would have just constantly agreed on things. So I think for me and my personal history with Five Tribes, I saw it everywhere. It was always being recommended. And it was a game that I just, at the time, didn't feel I would get that much play out of. I don't know. I just had this perception that it was a really heavy game, which it is. It is not. This is a fairly light big box game as far as the spectrum. I mean, there's medium rules overhead when you're learning the game, just in terms of learning what all the colors do. But this is a pretty light game for all intents and purposes, right, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that was my perception. So I didn't play it until I had the opportunity to play it. I've only played Five Tribes digitally. Just for transparency there.
All right. Well, let's get into the rules overview and meet you back on the other side with our deep dive discussion of this game.
Five Tribes is a 2 to 4 player game by Bruno Cathala that uses mancala at the core of its mechanism. The game takes place on a shared board of randomized tiles, each that show a value in terms of the endgame victory points for a player if they gain control of that tile through the course of play, and a power associated with landing on that tile and activating it. And by landing it, I mean on a player's turn, they will choose a tile anywhere on the board and pick up all the meeples in that location, dropping one meeple from all those that they picked up onto an orthogonally adjacent tile. and continue doing this until they've dropped all the tiles from their hand onto a final tile. But the final tile must follow the last meeple's same color rule, so the last tile that a player places a meeple onto must already have a meeple of the color dropped. So you're trying to match, let's say the last tile meeple you're going to drop onto a tile is red. You must place that meeple onto a tile that already contains a red meeple. When you do this, you'll activate both the power of the tile that you land on. So maybe it's collecting cards from a marketplace that you're going to use to collect sets of resources throughout the game, or maybe it's activating oases or temples that increase the value of that tile, or maybe it's buying a special djinn from a marketplace that's going to give you special powers that you can utilize throughout the game. Additionally, when you place that final meeple, you'll get to activate the power of whatever color meeple you place in one of the 5 tribes. So there's red, white, yellow, blue, and green meeples. Red meeples are assassins and let you take out other meeples on the board. White meeples are elders and score 2 points at the end of the game, but also help you recruit djinns to your side. Yellows are viziers, and there's a collection aspect where you want to have more viziers than each other player, but viziers are only worth 1 tile, or 1 victory point at the end of the game, so you don't want to have too many typically. Green allow you to pick up cards from the marketplace, and blue builder meeples score points instantly based on the number of blue meeple tiles around them. Play continues like this turn to turn, and there is an auction mechanism at the heart of 5 tribes where after every round of play, players take turns bidding for turn order. And this is an important part of 5 tribes because the range of strength of turns on the board varies dramatically. So a huge part of the core loop of 5 tribes is looking at the board, assessing what actions exist, and trying to bid to take an action at the right time to utilize the meeples on the board as effectively as possible. The game can end in 2 ways. Either the board runs out of valid moves where players can't follow the last meeple same color rule, at which point the game ends, or by totally picking up all of the meeples from a tile, right? So if there's only red meeples left on a tile and you place a red meeple as your final meeple, you'll pick up all the tiles, all the meeples remaining on that tile. If you do that, you get to claim it and score points for it at the end of the game. Players have a set number of tiles that they can claim, at which point a game end is triggered, and after that round, the game would end. Once the game end is triggered, players tally up their points of all the sets that they've sold, all the tiles that they've claimed, any additional points on those tiles based on special modifiers of adding palm trees or palaces to certain tiles, and a slew of other things to see who has scored the most points and is crowned the victor of 5 tribes.
Brandon, thanks so much for taking the time to record that rules overview. Hopefully that gives people a better sense of how this game plays to facilitate the understanding in this conversation. So why don't we start out as we always do and try and characterize the decision space in this very unique mancala style worker displacement game.
Ooh, worker displacement game. Is that official? Or is that a Jake Friedman coined descriptor
I've
of
heard
this?
that. No,
This
it's
is
not.
okay.
I've heard people say that about this game before. I think maybe even Bruno Cathala said that was like the design inspiration or something, like setting out to do like the reverse of a worker placement game.
That does seem like the type of terminology that a designer would use while pitching their game to a publisher, to be like, this is not worker placement, it's worker displacement. Yeah, but it doesn't really feel like a worker placement game to me at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's hints of it there for sure.
With the colors just having different powers associated with them and like activating certain locations if you end on them.
Activating spots.
Okay.
I mean, what? Yeah, all right. Let's actually just skip the nuanced conversation of what is worker placement and lean into 5 tribes and what this game is doing.
Yes. So, okay, characterizing the decision space. This is a waning decision space game, right? The board is set up at the start. You lay out all of these tiles, and then you seed those tiles randomly with different workers that come in one of 5, as in 5 tribes, 5 different colors of meeples. And those different colors have powers associated with them. I don't need you to belabor this, but in terms of clarity, there's no randomness for the most part in this game. There's a little bit with the market, the cards that come out.
And some of the djinn powers as well.
Some of the djinn powers. But it feels pretty deterministic, right? A lot of the uncertainty comes around when will you get to take a turn and how much will you pay to take that turn in terms of bidding for that spot with other players. Not that bidding provides much uncertainty. but just when you'll get to go and how
Yeah.
you set things up from turn to turn and what that will look like is where a lot of the uncertainty goes. So it's a high agency, low randomness game.
Yeah. I think I definitely agree on the waning overall game type. However, I think alongside with that, what gives it like a really interesting texture in the play to me is that while the pieces on the board and possible actions and places you might be able to finish on your turn to take actions is definitely waning over the course of the game, the potential for gaining points is much more dynamic than that.
Mm,
It's not as though the best moves are going to be available at the beginning, and then you'll have weaker moves throughout as things get removed from the board. In fact, often the peak point opportunity is going to be towards the early middle
yeah.
to middle of the game once some stuff has been moved around, and all of a sudden there's tiles that have a bunch of meeples piled up on it, giving you the opportunity to do some like crazy looping plays, and stuff like that, as opposed to the beginning where maybe you can't even fully clear a tile because there's just equal, you know, the meeples have been dispersed like randomly and equally at the start of the game, so there's not all of one type available on a tile for you to aim for.
Yep. And in terms of waning, you don't necessarily feel, sometimes waning decision space games, you can feel the pressure of the game waning and it's really tense. But because a lot of the point scoring opportunities, the large point scoring opportunities tend to come earlier in the game or in the middle ish, you don't necessarily at the end feel hyper stressed. Usually you can see the end clearly coming. You know, either, okay, Jake's going to go out, he's going to place his final camel on the board, this will be the last round, or it's just, you can count sort of, okay, there's probably 4 more moves on this board. The game's going to end roughly at this point. So there's not a lot of stress and tension inherent to this game. It really is a heads down search game in terms of, and there's lots of options to evaluate. But as Jake said, this game is all about finding a diamond in the rough of decisions here, especially in the middle of the game, trying to see things that other players might not see, or trying to set things up for yourself by setting up a double turn, maybe with the auction system, to then make the most of spending a little bit extra to go either first, or maybe setting it up so you're going last and not paying much, then paying a bunch to go first next time.
Yeah. I guess the last point I would say on this is around clarity. I think it's an interesting case where although it's mostly zero luck, very high agency game, you can get to game states where you have a lot of moves that are roughly equal but different. Just in, like maybe you're gaining the exact same workers and taking the exact same action, and you could go to do that at two different tiles. And then the difference, which is meaningful, is about like how you're leaving the board after you.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the game might fall down for some people in terms of like AP-ness. Like if you can be okay with just saying like, when I teach this game on the table, I usually tell people like, yes, we could all stare at the board for 5 minutes and maybe find a better move than the first good one we saw, but also maybe not. So let's just do, if you see a move that looks good, let's just all, kind of agree to this magic circle. We're going to like aim for that. Because, right, you could be looking at the two different moves I presented with you for a while and try and think about like, well, if I leave this, this worker on this tile over here, then it could facilitate, somebody doing another move over here. And there, and sometimes you do want to think about it. It's just like, okay, well, I don't want to leave 4 green pieces on this tile alone, so I'm going to put the yellow one there, right? Like the obvious things you can kind of just like do in the moment, but there's so much meaningful decision points within every single turn that some of it I feel like the game wants you to just kind of let go and like
Mm,
wash your hands of, at least
yeah.
the way I think it should be played most enjoyably. If you're
Yeah.
playing async online, spend all the time you want. Like, you're not going to bother anybody with it.
Do you think, okay, so Jake, do you think there's a few aspects of this game that I think contribute to it being a much stronger 2-player game than a game for 3 or 4 players? So we've alluded to some of these. One The game ends up being a little bit more interactive at 2 players because I can sort of see what you might be setting up and also sort of directly engage with potentially blocking you grabbing certain resources if that made sense, or based on what I remember you taking, or I don't know, just directly when it's a 2-player game, it's going to be inherently more interactive. The forward planning, you just have more potential because of the way that the turns are structured. There's a bidding system in this game where you bid for turnover or turn order. At 2 players, you have 2 tokens. So you can set up more double turns, potentially even taking 4 turns in a row in this game, which is wild and something we should definitely talk about. But you get even more room for strategic decision making and setup there. And the analysis paralysis is just reduced because you don't have to wait for 4 people to take their turns necessarily. I don't know. Do you like this game? We often talk about player counts at the end. What's your optimal player count for Five Tribes? Sort of as we go into this conversation, where do you feel like this game sits in your head, and what's your ideal way of playing?
Yeah, great question. The game is very different at 2 players without a doubt. More so than a lot of games. Like there are different components that you use at the 2-player game in terms of like having multiple auction pieces, right, to facilitate those like crazy turn sequences that you describe. And to me, a great comparison, or a comparison that I think is fair, is if you look at a different Cathala game in King Domino, where
Yeah.
you have like the 3 or 4 player game that's like light and breezy and fun, or the 2-player Mighty Duel version, which is like, holy cow, like we're actually this all of a sudden, we went from like a really light, nice entry game, gateway game, to a game that feels a lot more like tactical and hard edges and chess like with your opponent. And I think a lot of that same thing is here. Maybe to a
Mm.
lesser degree. There's like a smaller gap between the 2-player and the multiplayer game here.
In terms of
Um,
the feel, yeah.
in terms of the feel, but it just depends what you want. Like I think a lot of people prefer this game at 2 players,
Yeah.
and probably those people would prefer playing the Mighty Duel variant of King Domino for like the same reasons. But I think there's a really good merit case for playing base King Domino, and I think that the same is true here. So for me, that's more of a personal preference. Like, do you want like a more kind of light, fun, chaotic affair? Obviously, you're not getting anywhere close to as light as King Domino here, but or do you want that like highly tactical experience? And maybe a lot of people would defer to that with a game that is like heavier, right? It feels like maybe the mechanics are like pushing you in that way. Which again, I'm going to go back to the previous point I made about like kind of like creating the magic circle. Like it feels like the multiplayer 3 or 4 player game of Five Tribes requires a level setting conversation with your
Mm.
group about like how are we going to approach this, and perhaps if that is necessary, that is like a criticism of the game standing on its own merits.
Yeah.
Does that
I
answer the question you asked me?
totally. And I
I
think
like both.
Five Tribes is really cool, but I would be hard pressed not to. If someone sat down and said, "Hey, do you want to play Five Tribes with a group of 4?" I would say, "Sure." Would you be open to having Can we use a chess clock or something like that? Which would. That's not the way I approach playing games, but I think Five Tribes, it would be really hard to have a group that sort of self moderates, taking a little bit longer, because I think you do feel the payoff of spending the time puzzling out these turns, and part of that is because of the spatial mancala puzzle, which really is the core of the idea here, right? I think Five Tribes in a lot of ways feels to me like a design that started with, oh, I could make this cool mancala system, but it could be this spatial puzzle where instead of mancala going in a ring, you're playing mancala in a grid. And that feels like the heart of the game. It makes it very puzzly because you have so many different options. And like Jake said, you have this nice ebb and flow where all of the tiles start out with a set number of meeples on them. So the board feels fairly consistent, but over time, as certain tiles, you pick up all the meeples and drop them to adjacent tiles sort of in turn. You have this buildup of certain tiles getting lots of meeples on them, or maybe others where you're sort of paring down because you're trying to set up turns where you're finishing by placing a meeple on a tile that matches what's left on that tile. And ideally, you'd be sort of, let's say, dropping a green tile on a tile that only has green. So then you can pick up all those greens and activate the powers of them and claim in this sort of spatial control, claim that tile for yourself to get points at the end of the game. So I don't know. I think that, to your point, Jake, it's interesting how the 2-player does feel even more strategic. I think that's just probably a lot of 2-player games that can be played multiplayer end up sort of functionally operate that way, unless they're inherently political or something. But yeah, you sure feel it here. I like it a lot as a 2-player game. I think it works really well at 2.
I think if you had to twist my arm, I would say like the mechanisms lend themselves more towards that like tactical gameplay experience.
Yeah.
However, I just like have to say, because you say you can't see, like I've played this with a bunch of different groups and a bunch of people and really never encountered that problem with like the very simple instruction of like, let's just chill out and have a good time.
If you find a good move, take it.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't
like
sweat
we didn't
it.
play with chess clocks. We didn't play, and on the table, it's like we're talking 75 minutes or something. It's not like maybe less, right? If with an experienced group, definitely less. So yeah.
Okay, cool. I will say it's a Solomon scale. For me, 2-player is 3. 3-player is probably a 2, and 4-player is probably a 1. I don't know. It really drags.
It's just more vibes based, which is not a satisfying answer. Like when you're like auctioning points to like go first, and you're like, I think I want to go kind of like in the middle of this turn. Like it feels like things are congested on the board, and going like second or third would like lead to something opening up. So I'm gonna bid 3 points.
Sure.
And see what happens with that, right? I think because the way the mechanisms are, it feels like that's not what you should be doing.
Yeah.
But in practice, like that's exactly how to play this.
So you're saying just, heuristically vibe. Look for good moves and just trust in the moves your brain finds. Is that how you...
In the multiplayer one, for sure.
In the multiplayer, yeah. Okay, at 2-player, we need to talk about the auction. Because in some ways, the auction is...
I feel like this is the polarizing part of the game.
Mechanic.
Yeah. Because everybody kind of agrees. So like, there's a lot of AP potential, and that's probably not great for some people, and other people won't care. But I think this auction mechanism, people will either really like or really not like.
So, and it's a pretty simple auction mechanism. You're bidding endgame points for turn order, but you can also bid 0. And if you bid 0, though, or you can bid higher. I'm doing such a bad job explaining this auction mechanism, Jake. Yeah. So basically, you can bid 0, 1, 3, 5, 8. It goes super high. You take over.
I think it goes all the way up to 18, right?
8, 12, 18. Yep. Yeah. Jeez, could you have 18 points? That's wild. Okay.
Yeah, so you bid, like you have these pawns in your player color. You get 1 pawn in a multiplayer game, 2 pawns in a 2-player game. And so based on turn order, whoever played first on the previous turn will be the first to bid, right? And so that's like an inherent balancing thing that's going on, where often going first is good because you get like good options, but now you're going to be last to bid. And of course, the last person to go in the previous turn will be the last to bid, so they get to have perfect information for making whatever bid they want. And almost always, because the highest end of the track goes up to 18, that option can include, I would like to go first and take whatever action I'm seeing now that I want to take.
Yeah. So
yeah.
So this is...
I think that for me, I love this.
Yeah, of course you do.
I think it's like a very elegant mechanism that's doing a lot of different things for the design, right? It's like forcing people to kind of call their shot, right? Like gives you, right, where it's like, I think this is going to be a valuable bid, so I'm going to kind of gamble in some ways, right? There's a lot of tension in bidding where it's like, I really want to go first, and I think first is worth like 16 points or something, so I'm going to bid 8.
But the only way you could know that is by studying the board and finding a move that's going to pay you more than that. Right?
Yeah, right. I mean, there is definitely a search element to it. I'm not denying that. But sometimes it can be really obvious. Like, we just played a game that had like 3 white meeples alone on a tile, which is really strong because if I go there, I get the tile. I get to put my camel down the tile for endgame points, and I get to pick up all 4 of those white meeples, which are like really strong. So like I can just look at that and be like, I can kind of inherently know that's like worth a lot of points.
Sure.
Without like keeping the math fuzzy. I'm not like in my head. I'm not saying okay, that tile's worth 6 points, and each of these white meeples I pick up are worth 2 points each, so that's 14. Plus this action gives me a resource, that I need for my set collection. That's going to be worth like between like 9 and 6 more points for me or whatever. Like I'm not doing that, but like I just see all those components and like that's worth a lot. Like I want to take that action.
Yeah.
But if I'm first to go, like it's really tough to bid a lot because getting that action is great, right? If I bid 8 and I get that value, I feel so good about that. But if you jump me,
Go
bid
to 12.
12, then and get the great action, like I'm still out 8 victory points for like whatever's left, which
Yeah.
is why going last is so powerful in the auction.
Sure. Because then maybe you just bid 0, and then effectively you get a point bonus over everyone else equal to the difference, and you feel like the smart one. Jake.
And also like because of the dynamic scoring opportunities, like going first isn't always better. Sometimes
Sure.
it's just not better. Like you actively want to go last. In which case, like being the first to bid is actually good because if I bid 0 and you bid 0, you like bump me back, meaning you'll be first to play.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes like while there's like an inherent trade off between going first and then being like later to bid, like it's not always good to go first, and sometimes it's good to be the first to bid if you want to go last. So like everything is a little bit fuzzier in practice than it like seems on first blush, which I like.
Okay, sure. I hear you. But I still feel like, okay, I think we end up with this auction mechanism in this game, right? Because the core mechanisms of Five Tribes are really cool. Like I said, my intuition is that that's the starting point, right? Mancala on a grid. But then all of a sudden you quickly get this huge difference in terms of the point potential of given turns, right? So some scoring opportunities could, like you said, Jake, be worth, I don't, if you
Like
claim
40
the
points.
40 points or something, like a mind-boggling amount. Um, and maybe that's with some setup, but even you can have 20-point turns and you can have 1-point turns. You can take some pretty poor turns in this game.
Right.
So that's that huge difference. If you just, it's not going to work to just go around the table. Okay, we need some way to decide turn order. Okay, I'll just have people bid points. Players can optimize the game themselves. And to me, that feels like an effective solution, but not a fun one. It even lacks the sort of King Domino. So King Domino has a similar quote unquote issue where there's tiles in that game, another Bruno Cathala game, which is why Jake and I keep mentioning it, where certain tiles are going to be worth way more points than other tiles. So the who has access to going first in a given turn when you're going to be picking tiles is really powerful. So one of the ways that that game self-balances is by taking the tiles that are typically worth more, you have to go later on a future turn. You're paying the opportunity to take first on a current turn to take something you want, and then going later on a future turn. And to me, that small difference, instead of just saying, okay, bid points to see who goes first, more or less, feels gamier. It feels more engaging. It just feels, to me, more interesting. This just feels so mathematically rote in a way, as if the game is inviting you, okay, you can look at the board and you can speculate, just find a good move, and then just, do your best, but you'll know if a bit of 8 is dumb. And I think that I wish that there was a little bit of a gamier element to speed up this part of the game, because the search on the board is already, it's not crazy. You're going to, especially by the middle of the game, sort of know which moves, which tiles you're trying to get. The game does some good signposting by not making all the tiles worth the same. There's things to look at, things to look for. Okay, I'm collecting sets of goods. I'm focused there. But I wish there was a really, of course I do, right? Given my personal taste, something where we're all playing a card or something and revealing those simultaneously to see who goes first. And this is hand management. I don't know. For me, I just get to, I think the game's fun. I love the actions. I love the huge combo turns. It looks cool on the table. It's creative and the arc of it's fun. But then you get to the auction and it's just like, oh, this is so slow and you're making me do homework. Why? I just want to
Yeah,
play the game.
I get the criticism for sure. And I think another piece of it too is like it takes a pretty high, like a pretty good skill ceiling game and just like elevates it, right? Because
Yeah.
it basically says like whoever's better at the, parsing the board and finding the most valuable move, and whether you're playing that like within like we're gonna just try and play quickly or take as much time as you want, like somebody is probably going to have some kind of competitive advantage there amongst players.
Yeah.
And then the auction on top of it just like amplifies it. Like I can
Yeah.
already see what moves better for than you, and then now it gets me this additional layer ability to like demonstrate that knowledge by bidding a small amount when appropriate or bidding a high amount when appropriate. So I think like for in that way, it's like, this is a game that maybe again, like is not quite signposted in a way, and not one we'd expect from Days of Wonder either. Like when we think about those other games, Heat,
Ticket to Ride.
Ticket to Ride, right? Like this almost invokes more of like that old school Euro game where it's like the best player is probably going to win vast majority of times and possibly by a lot. Almost like, an Agricola or like a Kalis or something like
Yeah.
that.
Totally. Or a Mass Trilogy game.
Right.
Like goodness, you even
I
have the
think
bidding.
T-Call is like I think is a great comparison for
Yeah.
this one in terms of like when I say like this is a search game, the Mass Trilogy absolutely fall into that category.
Yeah. This is 100% a puzzly search game. Low gamey, high puzzly. Since we just use really nuanced terminology on the show. Low gamey, high puzzly. Okay. Jake, should we pivot and talk about some of the special actions? Because I feel like those really do lend the game its sort of core feel, and sort of the combo turns that you can set up are, for me, where some of the most fun happens.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's important. And as much as we talk about how like difficult and challenging it is to parse the board, like these
These help.
do help a ton. Like very often in the game, you can kind of say to yourself, like, which action on the board do I want to take? Like,
Yeah.
there are a lot of situations where it's like, I really want to go to the space that lets me buy 2 cards in the market for 6 coins because that's like such an efficient and powerful action. And then work back from there and, and
Yeah.
kind of say, like, how can I access this tile? And then to think about, like, you might have multiple options there about which meeple type, I guess tribe you want to use, and then you already have like kind of a plan together. It's like
Yep.
great, I can get this market tile with the green merchants to clear off 2 things and then get the 2 I really need. All of a sudden, working back from that board action. That's often how I kind of like cut through the noise.
Yeah. Or maybe it's early game and there's a lot of red meeples, the assassins still on the board. And you can sort of say, okay, it's unlikely I'm going to be able to claim a tile by, picking up the last tile, the last meeple of a color on that tile. But maybe I can get a tile down to 1 and then use an assassin to remove that and claim the tile that way.
Right.
So I find myself usually starting early game, I'm looking at the red meeples that are out there and seeing what I can string together to see if I can claim a tile. And that definitely helps speed up the search at a time where the board is its busiest. So the red meeples also, they don't just let you potentially remove tiles from the board, but you can remove an opponent's yellow or white meeple that's in front of them that they already have. And I do think that this game leaves room for edge cases in a way that aren't that hard to remember, but could be theatrically fun. Like taking out an opponent's yellow tile so that you have 1 more than them, so that you score 10 points for that. That's cool. That's a
Yeah.
fun moment. Just reaching over the table and knocking it over or whatever. It's a fun quirk.
So I do think like heuristics get you pretty far, right? Like if
Yeah.
you start saying like, can I claim a tile?
Yes. Yeah.
If yes, probably like do that, and then follow the same steps afterwards of like, okay, like which, if I can claim one, multiple, like which action do I prefer to take? If still multiple, which meeples to remove? And you could do that like, okay, I can't claim a tile, so which action do I want to take? Right.
Yeah.
And then follow the same steps down. Like that gets you pretty far.
Totally.
So should we talk about like, so basically on the board, you've got large markets and small markets for getting 1 or 2 things. And then you've also got castles and palm trees, which work the same way as each other and
Yep.
basically increase the value of the tile if once a player claims it for every time it's been acted upon. Like those ones are all like good if you're claiming them that turn, and otherwise terrible because you don't get to like do anything.
Yep.
And then there's like the sacred places where you can spend the white meeples in order to claim a Jin
To get.
tile,
Yep.
which gives you points and also special powers that could be activated, or passive abilities. And I guess before we get any further, Brendan, we should mention like one very unfortunate thing. I guess we could say unfortunate or problematic aspect of the game, which is related to the sacred tiles and a couple other actions. Some of the cards that you can take in the more recent printings of Five Tribes are called Fakir cards, and you can use those to help activate the sacred places. You can use those to activate some of your Jin abilities. You can use them to amplify the effect of some of the other Meeple types. But in the original printing of the game, instead of being called Fakir cards, they were titled Slave cards, which is, obviously, I hope to me it feels obvious in that it just absolutely doesn't fit with like the tone and theme of the game being like this kind of like lighthearted, magical Arabian Nights theme.
Yep.
Right. And like, of course, that was a part of like history there. And, we're not the people most qualified to talk about this, but it's just like does not at all fit with like, it just felt so gratuitously unnecessary. And actually, the printing of the game I bought has these because I got this game a really long time ago. And it's absolutely been a reason not to take this off of the shelf,
Yeah.
especially lately. Cause like of all the games I own, like, do I want to like take the one off that has just like these like gratuitously unnecessary slave cards that I have to like either explain or, just be like, well, it's not like this in the newer version, right? I don't know. It's
Yeah.
just weird.
Totally. In an otherwise fantastical, like the gins in this game that you were mentioning, Jake, that you can claim at these special sites are clearly, uh, they're just they're fantastic. They're not a real thing. So this is a created world
Right.
that
There's
nothing. Yeah,
all
it's
over the place.
whimsical, and there's nothing whimsical about slavery. And it's a bummer that it was in this game. It's great that it has been updated so that there's a version of this game that doesn't have those cards, and they're called fakirs. I think I'm remembering that's probably the reason why I didn't buy this game initially. Is I looked it up and I probably saw like, oh, there's slave cards in this game, and I was just like, I don't need to go there, But yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. We should have probably mentioned it at the game background, but forgot until now. So glad we got it in there. Should we talk about some of the other actions, like the actual Meeple special actions?
Yeah,
The
well,
namesake
I think we
five
should, but before we
tribes?
get into them, yes, the namesake five tribes. Can you talk to us about the gins for a minute? Because I think those are another important part of this game, that they give you these special powers. Those come into the evaluating the potential. It gives a wrinkle to the auction, right? Because your ability to utilize a specific power might not be the same as someone else. There's certain gins that you can claim. So the one that you want might still be there in the future. But I think they add a lot of texture to this game that make it not feel too samey from play to play. Also, some of them are oddly specific.
Yeah. I think like the role that the Jin cards play in this game like is in the ability to create asymmetry among factions, right? This is
Yeah.
not a game that has built-in asymmetry, no player powers to start, but once you purchase a Jin at one of the sacred places, it can really change the math for you. All of a sudden, right, you might really prize certain actions or types of meeples above others, and like more so to than the person to your left. So
Yeah.
I think that influx of, I guess it's, kind of like a natural asymmetry, right? Something that comes about over the course of play is necessary. And I like that addition here because otherwise, from the other mechanisms of the game, you wouldn't have any of that at all. You would just always be prioritizing everything the same amongst all the players.
It's interesting because they're costed differently, right? Like, or they give a different number of points. So whenever you
Yeah.
take a Djinn, you put it in front of you, you know you're going to get a set number of points no matter
You
what. So
can
maybe,
tell how strong Cathala thought each of these powers was.
yes, that's the key. How strong he thought they were, because the 10-point ones are seemingly less powerful than the 6-point ones, but sometimes that doesn't play out to quite be enough to make up for it. So, for example, Jafar is a Djinn whose power is at the end of the game, viziers you hold are worth 3 points instead of 1. So, adding 2 points for every vizier you have. If you had 7 viziers, that's a 20 point tile. That's
That's a strong
amazing.
one.
That's a really strong one. And then there's this like Haggis, this 10-point Djinn, where whenever you place a palace, you can put it in a neighboring location instead. So at most, you're probably going to pick up, like an extra 5 if you're lucky, 10 points.
Yeah. But I don't know. Like,
they're fine.
They're fine. It honestly, like, I'm okay with a component like this being not perfectly balanced because it gives players you get to see which 3 are available to you. So that's like
Yeah.
more information you can factor in both on your turn of like what action space do I prioritize and in the auction. So it's okay to me. Like maybe even a good thing that there's some slight imbalance between these. So like it matters which one you go for. And then the other thing I would say about that too is like a lot of this depends on the game state. So at the end of the game, the one Jafar, whichever one you said helps with the
Yeah.
gold ones. If you don't have those and it's late in the game, that's worthless to you. Where like the 10-point one is always going to be 10 points no matter
Right.
what. So like those can be like super strong late game moves to take.
Yeah.
I really like the one. I don't have the list in front of me, but there's one. I think it only gives you 4 points, which is like the lowest possible base value, but it gives you the ability to double one of your blue actions. Like when you pick up the blue meeples, you can pay, I think, a vizier or sorry, an elder and a fakir card in order to double the value of the blue. So it's like a total build around card. Like
Yeah.
once you have that, now all of a sudden, like it can completely warp your game state to where you're trying to like, set up some of these like big combo turns that you've alluded to, like go last, add 2 more blue meeples to a space that already had blue meeples, and maybe try and get an extra Fakir card while you're at it so that you can go first on the next turn and get like 46 coins and then double it for like massive game swinging moves. So I love that kind of like build around cards. Also, that's probably the best example of it. So I don't think very many others quite get to that like extent of like focus on this strategy. But I like that those exist too. To like, I'm
Yeah.
going to just go down a completely different path this game than I've done before.
Totally. And they're another example of Cathala trying to design something that just gives the player a little bit of something more to focus on, a signpost that says, okay, you got this, now do this.
Right.
They're important glue that helps the game, though I don't know. They're not the most memorable for me.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in a lot of times, like you don't want that. You just want like the passive
6
ones
points.
that's gonna
Yeah.
like give you an extra coin every time you use a red assassin meeple, or 2 if your opponent uses it. Like getting that on the first turn,
Sure.
that's awesome because like you're just gonna be getting passive benefit the whole game. That's kind of unavoidable for your opponents.
Yep. Cool. Okay. Should we talk about the 5 tribes? The eponymous 5 tribes?
Yeah. Okay. So we got yellow. That one is gives you 1 point per vizier that you have, and 10 points. You have the most at the end of the game.
But it's 10 points for each player you have more than.
Oh, okay. So that's good. So interestingly, these ones are like so bad in the 2-player game, but like can be really good in the other, because in the 2-player game you have to invest way more to get the most of them because you're just both going to be able to pick these up. Whereas and at most, like let's say I get 6 and you get 4, that's 16 points, and I've invested at least 3 actions claiming these probably. Whereas in a 4-player game, right, there's less of these to go around. So maybe I just like set up one play where I'm able to scoop up 4 of these. And now all of a sudden I'm going to get 44 or 34 points, I guess, for 1 action efficiency. And so it's just like the math does not math in the 2-player version of the game with these.
Quite as well. Yeah. Which, that just changes. I'm less focused on them in a 2-player game.
Right.
So
And
it
then sometimes
just
like
changes the
nobody's going for
hierarchy.
them. Like, okay, hey, like grab 3 of these right now. And maybe that's like a extra 13 points I just got, which is
Sure.
still big for a
Right.
single
Yeah.
turn.
Nice. Then there's the white tile, the white meeples. Those are the elders. These are important because they score 2 points at the end of the game for each you have. But then they're also important because they help you buy the gins during the game. So they're a type of meeple that you'd like to score early, typically because it's just nice to pick up some points, but then also because you can spend them to make more points. So they're an important sort of early game thing that you can look at to sort of say, how do I get a few of these and how do I manage this small sort of economy of this resource that exists? I think these add a nice little wrinkle to the decision space in terms of adding just one more thing for you to think about.
Yeah. Generally always happy to get
Pick these up.
because they really increase your opportunity space, right? Like if you don't have any of these, you just never want to land on the sacred places. So it's
Yeah.
nice to have some of these in your back pocket to like open up that like a fifth of the board or maybe more. I feel like there's a lot of the sacred space tiles.
Yeah.
Okay, so next is the green ones. These are the ones that like give you cards from the market, which is the set collection aspect of the game, which we should say can reward you a crazy amount of points. I almost think like of everything in the game, you can kind of pick your path pretty equitably, but if you ignore the market, I think you're making a bad choice. Like
Yeah.
it's difficult to succeed in this game without getting at least one big set of cards. So for every green one you pick up, you're allowed to take that many number of cards from the front of the market, and it's like a kind of like a waterfall, but it resets only at the end of a round.
Which is another reason you might want to go first in a round when thinking about the auction, or maybe another reason why you might want to go later and hope people pick up some of these cards so you can grab some of the cards further back. That's another element of some uncertainty, but the points for them too. So you can sell sets of these resource cards. And if you have, for each different value, different type you have, you get 1, 3, 7, 13, 21, 30, 40, 50, or 60 points.
So
Which,
we've eschewed the triangular scoring.
yes, sort
We're
of.
doing something completely different.
Yeah, it's almost triangular up to 21, and then it
Yeah,
just, goes up
you're
by
like,
9, then
all
10,
right,
10, 10.
yeah.
Yeah, I
I
love
think
it.
that's so funny for some reason.
Goes off of feel. Yeah. Like a smooth peak. So, Jake, these for me, the greens, I think a turn where you just pick up 4 green tiles, you put a green on a tile that has 3 greens already, and then you pick up 4 cards, just feels great.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think almost like it's hard to say like
the
anything is
best
like
tile. Yeah.
heuristically at the top because it's so situational.
Yeah.
But like I said, I think the market's like the only thing you can't ignore. Like you can definitely win this game without buying a single gin, no
Sure.
problem.
Yeah.
I don't think you can win this game without getting at least one set where you're like getting into the 10 point per card range. So that'd be like at
Sure.
least like 7 cards.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then like the other thing you could be getting is the fakir cards, and those are just so flexible that like
Yeah.
again, you're always going to be able to find like something to use them with. And most commonly that'll be with the builder tiles where you can just amplify it for every fakir you discard when you use it.
Yeah. So you want to pick up builders when you have more. No, you want to place a builder on a tile that only has builders left on it to claim that location. But then you also want there to be lots of builders, the blue meeples around it, because you're counting the number around it and the number that you're picking up and putting back in the bag by it being the last tile that you place on as a multiplier, like Jake said, and then you're just getting raw points for it. And the fakir cards, like Jake mentioned, you can use to amplify the multiplier factor by each fakir you discard. And then those fakir cards have a similar sort of modifying effect for lots of the other colors. So or that's not really true, but they also modify the red meeples, which are the assassins that we talked about, where when you place them, you get to remove a meeple from a tile nearby based on how many reds meeples you're picking up, or you can spend fakirs to increase the distance. You can also use fakirs to replace the cost of buying a gin with 1 elder, so the fakir can count as an elder.
I think the blue is doing a really important thing from the decision space perspective again here too, where that this is the aspect of the game that's kind of like adding that like combo feel of like a big move,
Mm,
because the way these work is you really only want to be hitting it for like a big influx of points, and
yeah.
that would be when you have a lot of fakir cards to discard towards it. So like I in an ideal situation, I think you use the blue builders like only once, and you're like discarding like 3+ fakir cards to like maximize the value of that. So it puts it in like a really interesting space in terms of like heuristics, where like often like blue is the last thing you want to be doing, um except for when it's like the absolute best thing you could be doing and you want to like spend up in order to like guarantee yourself the ability to take a massive blue card or a massive builder turn.
Yeah, totally. Which is fun because you can turn fakir cards into being worth like, I don't know, more than 5 points each.
Like 6 per, yeah,
Yeah,
right. It could be really, really big. So that's kind of like it like again, like it adds like that kind of like dynamic point potential influx to the game in a really interesting way, because yeah, you want to be careful, I guess, is the way you're like distribute these around the board. You're like inching them closer to where like the prime spot would be, and then you just want to like take it when it arises.
totally. Cool. So that's each of the 5 tribes. We talked about the market. We talked about the territory mechanic and claiming spaces. This is really the points come from lots of different places. And I think this is a game that wants you to do a little bit of everything. But like Jake said, there are some things that kind of matter more than others, or areas that you can ignore maybe more than others if the game doesn't quite incentivize it. Maybe it's later in the game and none of the gens are really going to give you that many points. There's just better options. Yeah. Jake, what do we, as we come in towards the sort of closing thoughts part of this episode? So, what stands out to you about 5 tribes? It's now 10 years on, a game you enjoy and maybe took a little bit of break from and have really been enjoying that now that we've gone back to it. What do you, yeah,
Yeah,
what are you
I
left
think
with?
takeaways like high skill ceiling game, like
Yeah,
extremely high, more than you think. Especially for this publisher, I think that's something to know about the game. And I think like it's a game of very high search and interaction, right? So that's kind of like there. I think like A Feast for Odin is a game that has like really high search in the sense that like you have this like massive menu of actions, and like you want to like take your time and make sure you're picking like an optimal one of everything that's available to you. This has that same thing, but like you're really jostling with players, both in terms of the auction and in your movements on the board, and there's no way around that, which to me makes it like kind of in a twin decision space with a game like T-Call. Especially if you enjoy T-Call with the auction variant, right? Then it like really feels like kind of a twin decision space in that sense. I think out of the two games, like I prefer T-Call because it feels like a little bit more like streamlined and distilled in a way that feels satisfying to me right now. But this feels like the more like, and it's funny because you said it wasn't like a gamery game. To me, it feels like the gamery version of T-Call. It's like kind of like T-Call, but like with like special powers you can get and activate over the course of the game, and like more distinct paths to victory and things to focus on rather. So I mean, but squarely in that like camp of like who can search the best, and use their actions wisely.
yeah. Certainly more abstract than T-Call. To me, I think Jake,
I mean, kind of.
it's pretty, I don't know, T-Call has this cool like thematic hook where
I mean,
you're
okay. I mean, yeah,
exploring.
whatever.
Okay, I mean, you can make. Okay, I think for me,
Yeah, yeah, okay. I mean, T-Call does not seem very thematic to me. I mean,
I
you're just
okay,
like moving like archaeologists like from your field school, I guess, like around to like sit on top of temples.
it's true. Okay,
It's very
okay,
abstract.
okay, fair enough, fair enough. I guess it just feels a little bit more focused and
It's
grounded in
that I
terms of
agree
what
with
you're
that.
doing. Yeah,
Definitely.
and I think for me, 5 Tribes is a really interesting game held together with an auction system that pushes it in the opposite direction of what I wish it did. And I think having played it maybe 15, 20 times now, I'm not surprised that this didn't spawn a whole genre. right? There's not a whole genre of grid-based mancala games out there that's sort of
Yeah.
vying for the number one spot, because Five Tribes kind of does the thing. It's a cool idea. It does the cool idea well, sufficiently for sure. And I think that the inherent problems that are here aren't easy to be solved, right? So sometimes with board games, there's sort of these novel mechanisms that can come together that, because of all of the factors involved with searching for and sort of operating the game, no matter how much you sort of poke or prod the systems, you're not going to fix some of the core downsides of that system. And I can see why this game hasn't spawned a ton of imitators. But with that said, I also see why this game has a lot of fans. It's really fun. And maybe that's kind of a great place to be as a designer, right? To sort of carve out this game playing experience that's tough to emulate, because in your one entry in sort of the mechanical creation, there's not a lot more to do. So it can stand on its own. And now, 10 years on, still be in the BGG top 100, a game that people are talking about, an interesting game that I think sticks with you. Though for me, this is definitely one that I'll remember as more interesting than it is fun, and maybe more for me to learn from than to have fun playing. But I like
Yeah.
it. It's a cool game.
I think you should try it on the table, like, one
Okay.
time. I think you might be surprised, because, like, we played a lot of games together, and I had like a massive head start in just
Sure.
experience playing the game, as I probably played it 20 times before we started playing it together. And like, you
Yeah.
definitely like improved at the game as we
Phew.
played. But like, I think that playing it asynchronously in this case, and like not seeing, right, like all of a sudden the board has changed and you didn't necessarily see like the way I
Sure.
moved stuff around and what I did, really hindered your ability to pick it up in a
Sure.
way that I think is like, makes it seem more opaque to you perhaps than it actually is.
Interesting. Well,
So that's a thought that I would leave you
I'll
with.
take
But
you up. If we find ourselves together and you offer to play Five Tribes, I won't say no. But I bet you won't offer.
probably not.
Yeah. Okay.
Play it with somebody else, though.
Okay.
All right.
We both
Well,
made our point then.
okay. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you all so much for listening. Please, if you have the time, send us a review. We didn't have one to read out this week, which is a massive, massive bummer. So please fix that for next week. As always, if you're interested in finding more about Decision Space or want to talk more about this episode, best place to do this is on our Discord. You can find a link to join that in the description of this podcast. There's also more stuff on decisionspacepodcast.com. And we should thank Hembry for intro and outro song. Reach out.
Bye all.
Bye.